Okay, so this is going to be an opening traps video and an opening repertoire video all in one. It's also going to be a response video to Gotham Chess's How to Crush People with the Caro-Kann, which was actually a pretty good video. I'll leave a link to in the description where he covers how to play the Caro-Kann as black. But today we're going to look at how to actually play against the Caro-Kann, and we'll see a lot of tricky, trappy lines stemming from the main variation I recommend, which is a two knights attack. And this opening is not only really popular among like the super GM level, it's very reputable, but at the club kind of amateur level, which I assume is most people watching this video, kind of sub 2000, maybe even sub 1200. There's a lot of ways for black to go wrong. And for the players who are unprepared as black, it's very easy to stumble into the countless traps. And that's what we'll cover in this video. And for those that want to analyze on their own, I will be leaving a link to the Lichess study where I outline the repertoire. Every chapter has its own main variation and annotations. So before we get into all the tricks and traps and analysis, I do want to thank the sponsor of today's video, which is Audible. If you're not familiar with them, which you should be by now, but they are the world's largest audiobook platform. And the thing I love about Audible is the fact that I don't have to sit down and actually read a physical book. I can listen across all my devices, whether I'm taking long walks, listening while washing dishes, or even listening in the shower. And it's one of the main ways I stay educated and informed about all the areas that I'm interested in these days. Now, I'll give a sneak peek to my Audible library. And one book I want to recommend, it's called Deep Work by Cal Newport. It's not only helped me with my overall chess improvement when I want to study chess, I'm able to find an environment where I can maximize my effectiveness and productivity, but it's also helped me with content creation and even recording videos like this, where I can get in the zone and be as productive and efficient as possible. So, if you want to get this audiobook or any other audiobook of your choice, be sure to click the link in the description, audible.com/I am Rosen, or text I am Rosen to 500 to get a 30-day free trial. And with that, let's get back to the chess. Okay, so as you probably know by now, the two knights attack is e4, c6, knight f3, d5, knight c3. Doesn't actually matter which order you develop your knights, because almost every Caro-Kann player will play this and this. So as long as you can get to this position, this marks the beginning of the two knights attack, where things can already branch out depending what black does. And in this video, we'll look at the most common moves for black, including pawn takes pawn, bishop g4, knight f6, and d4. And I'll be sure to timestamp everything below. Oops, didn't mean to hit my mic. Sorry, Mike. I also have everything here in the study, which should be relatively organized. So feel free to hop around chapter to chapter. But I do encourage people to watch all the way through to see all the traps, which are not maybe the most so well known, especially to Gotham chess viewers. So let's hop into the first chapter here, which is actually one of the most common traps that Caro-Kann players will fall into. And it happens after d takes e4, knight takes e4, and bishop f5. And a lot of players will play this move, bishop f5, because the mainline Caro-Kann, if we look at pawn d4, d5, knight c3, takes, bishop f5 is like the main line that most Caro-Kann players are trained to play. The tricky thing about this move order, with white delaying pawn d4 and accelerating the development of the knights, it turns out bishop f5 is a mistake because white has knight g3, and there's ways to get continual initiative against especially the bishop and just the king side in general. And we're going to see a very nice line here how the play flows really nicely for white. most of the time what happens is black will get just an awful position within the first 10 moves. So just to show, if we look at the database, bishop f5 has been played over 100,000 times, and this move does deserve a question mark. This is a clear mistake. And after knight g3, bishop g6, we'll play through the most common line for both sides, pawn h4. And here white is already threatening to trap the bishop with pawn h5. This means black pretty much has to move the h-pawn. Most of the time, black will play h6. And here we keep improving our position while making threats. We can start with knight e5. There's a reason why we don't play h5 so soon. The idea of knight e5, of course, we want to take and really destroy black's kingside pawn structure, but we're also opening the diagonal for the queen so that after bishop h7, we can go straight in and play queen h5, already threatening mate. And now we're putting black in kind of an awkward position. There's really not too many ways to defend the checkmate. 117 people got mated right away with this. Most common move here is pawn g6, which is incredibly ugly given it just prevents the bishop from having any life in the position. Another attempt is queen d5. This is even worse than g6 because after bishop c4, white is skewering the queen and the f-pawn and is winning material. The coordination of white's position is really nice. The queen defends the knight, knight defends the bishop, bishop skewers stuff, and black is already just completely losing here. So let's take a look at g6, because here we have a really nice oh no my queen opportunity. We actually don't need to move the queen on h5. We can develop the bishop and say, oh no my queen. 518 people have taken the queen, resulting in bishop takes f7 checkmate. Yeah, and some reasonably high rated players. I actually had this once against a 2000 plus rated player. Pretty sure it was a bullet game, but goes to show black does have to be careful. Most people will play e6 here. And now the trickiest move to play is not queen f3, which obviously looks attractive, which would threaten checkmates. But even trickier is queen e2 with more of a subtle threat. And of course, if we play queen f3, white's still better. There's knight f6. But when we play queen e2, we are threatening to take on f7 and then take on e6 with complete destruction of black's kind of king safety. And if black plays any of these so-called kind of natural moves, bishop g7, knight f6, bishop d6, knight d7, all of these moves are blunders due to the idea of knight takes f7 and queen e6. So the most common move, actually two of the most common moves are just blunders here. Bishop g7, we take, and if we see how this plays out, if king takes, white is just mating by force, king f8 and queen f7. Very similar is if knight f6, we take on f7, and we can see just based on the win percentage, 700 plus games, white is winning 100% of them. After king takes, and queen f7 again is checkmate. So a lot of ways for black to go wrong. Even going into this position, if black is careful and plays, let's say queen c7 is one of the better moves, queen c7 or queen e7 to reinforce f7, white can continue with pawn d4. And even though white's not up any material, the position is just really, really nice for white. Harmonious development. Meanwhile, black's only developed minor piece is just complete garbage on h7. White is ready to continue with bishop f4 to pressure the queen, probably queenside castling, and we'll have a lot of nice opportunities going into the middle game. So going back to where black went wrong was the move bishop f5. Most likely, if black plays this move, they'll stumble into the line that we just saw. It's quite forcing, and white has a significant advantage even after pawn h4. So there's a few other things to know regarding this position. If black plays bishop g4, there is an opportunity to transpose into what we just saw. White can play h3. Now, if black takes, we're happy to take back and just have a lead in development. If black maintains a pin, we can play knight g3, hitting the bishop again. And if bishop g6, we can play pawn h4. And this is exactly what we just saw previously. White did lose a tempo playing h3, h4, but black also lost some time moving the bishop a bunch of times. And this could go into the same exact line. Oh no, my queen. And once you start reviewing this enough, the lines should become very natural to remember because pretty much every move is a threat. Once the bishop develops either to f5 or to g4, we just keep throwing punches until we get a really nice position. Let's move on to some alternatives for black from this position. And moving on to chapter 3, we're going to look at one of the lines that Levy recommends in his Caro-Kann video, the so-called Tartakower Variation, which is knight f6. And I believe Tartakower Variation is actually when white has a pawn in d4 and no knight on f3. But yeah, the plan for black is hoping white takes on f6. Generally, black will take back and then have easy development with a very stable kind of defensive pawn structure on the king side. Now, the move I recommend against knight f6 is what I would consider by far the trickiest move, is to play queen e2. Which looks a bit odd at first. Generally, you don't want to move your queen to block in your own bishop. But in this case, it is played with a clear kind of positional threat of taking on f6 and then preventing black from taking back with the e-pawn. So in cases where black develops, we can take, and if black has to take with the g-pawn, we've made some progress with kind of damaging black's structure. Very unlikely black will castle on the king side, and meanwhile white can complete development. Generally, I like to play a move like d3, restricting the bishop, then go for the kingside fianchetto, where we can eventually castle. And with the fianchetto, the g file is not really an issue because we're going to have a very, very solid kind of formation on the king side. And meanwhile, we have ideas of knight h4 to harass the bishop, and further ideas of fianchettoing the other bishop on the queen side with some nice middle game play. So I don't want to give like too many specific lines because there's a lot of ways things can branch out, but this is just one kind of simple setup for white where white can get a very solid position going into the middle game. Now, if black doesn't play bishop f5 and plays, what is this, a fifth most common move, knight b d7, and I'm hiding the opening explorer because I don't want to spoil the next move for white. This is the worst move in the position for black. I saw over 1,700 players have played this as black. It's now white to move and checkmate in one. I would hope most viewers already see the move for white, but if you haven't seen it by now, the move is knight d6 checkmate. Actually, over 3,000 people have walked into this. There are probably some transpositions, but knight d6 is a really nice middle game smother mate. If you haven't seen this pattern before, it can come as a real shock, but goes to show that if you're a Caro-Kann player, you have to be really, really careful of not getting smother mated in the middle game. So going back, the most common move for black is to take on e4. And this will actually bring us to chapter 4. So real quick review, 2 knights attack. We're focusing on d takes e4, knight takes e4, Levy's recommendation, and now queen e2, the setting up the tricks, potential tricks along the e-file. And now after takes, takes. One of the main plans for black here, actually the most common move, is to now play knight d7 to bring this knight to f6 and to try to attack the white queen. And here we can just complete development, bishop c4, knight f6. And this is another moment where we're not going to move our queen, but we're going to make an even more powerful counter threat with the move knight e5. Another case where we can say, oh no, my queen, merge link below, and then we deliver checkmate on f7. So just out of curiosity, yeah, 647 people mistakenly took the queen as black. And yeah, good job to everyone who delivered the mates. Wow, some pretty high rated players in the top games too. I assume these are bullet games, but still, this can potentially work against 2200 plus rated players. So more commonly after 95, black will play pawn e6. And this is where we do have to move our queen back. We can play queen e2. And here we have a position where white is already ahead in development and has very easy kind of development going forward. The line I give here is bishop d6. We can play d4, reinforcing the knight, opening the bishop. Let's say black castles. Take note, I'm generally following the most common moves for black, so this is what you're most likely to get if you play this line. And here I recommend that white don't castle kingside, which would lead to a more positional game, but start with a move bishop g5, and then prepare to castle queenside, and then go for the kingside attack. And from this position, the most common move is pawn h6. And here I recommend playing pawn h4. This is by far the most aggressive approach. And this is setting up the so-called fishing pole trap, where if black takes, it leads to very, very big problems for black along the h-file. If the knight tries to save itself, either knight h7, actually wherever the knight goes from this position, white's going to respond with queen h5 with what I believe is forced mate. If we look at knight h7, queen h5, I don't see how black avoids the checkmate here. If rook e8, we could take the knight, but even better is taking on f7, and then another kind of semi-smothered mate with the knight. Yeah, very similar if knight here. We play queen h5, and there's no stopping queen h8 checkmate. So the bishop on g5 is poisonous after pawn h4, and we can see based on the win percentage for white, even after pawn h4, white is winning 77% of the time. So goes to show that it's already difficult on a practical level for black. Most common move is bishop e7 here. And this is where we can queenside castle and get a very pleasant kind of attacking middle game going forward. Again, if black takes, we're happy to open the h-file and have the prospect of mating really quickly. If black doesn't take, we have ideas of playing g4, eventually taking on f6 and then going for g5 to then later open the g-file. If queen a5 is played, pretty sure we can go ahead and play. Wow, engine is already giving +4 for white. Yeah, you can maybe explore with engine moves. I like the move g4 though, with a plan of taking and going for g5. And just another position where white can get a really nice attack from very early on. Okay, so I think it's time to look at some alternatives for black. Going back to the start of the two knights attack, we did just look at several different lines after d takes e4. Now it's time to look at what happens if black plays pawn d4, which looks like one of the more kind of threatening, aggressive approaches for black, kicking the knight right away from the centralized c3 square. And this is a line whenever I encounter, I usually look forward to playing, because after knight e2, we counterattack the pawn. Black pretty much has to play pawn c5 here. And now we can develop the knight to g3. And even though we spent already 3 moves with this knight in the opening, black has only pushed pawns so far. Arguably, black is a bit overextended, and white has some very easy development with potential later to attack on the king side with the already well-placed kingside knights. So I don't want to dig too deeply into this variation, but I do want to give one example line, show a few traps, and show that white's play is pretty fun and simple from here on out. So most common move is knight c6 for black. We can put the bishop on c4, targeting the f7 pawn. And now one trap here is that if black plays pawn e5, which is the most common move, we can start with pawn d3. And then if black plays, again, the most common move, knight f6, this is already a blunder. Let's give this a question mark. Now it's white to move and win material. And this seems like an odd type of blunder because it looks supernatural, just developing, getting ready to castle. But the problem for black lies in the weakness of the f7 pawn. White can very simply bring the knight to g5, now attacking f7 twice, and there's no good way for black to defend the pawn without losing material. Maybe the best try is bishop e6, but then we can recommend taking with knights, keep our light squared bishop, and then be up a pawn, also with the light square domination. So if we look at the opening database, there have been 450 games where white has seized the opportunity with knight g5. Very high winning percentage for white. So for this reason, instead of pawn e5, it's better for black to play pawn e6. Even though this blocks in black's own light squared bishop, it does blunt the power of white's light squared bishop. And then play can develop pretty naturally from here. White can play d3, knight f6, castling. A6 is a pretty common idea for black, going for pawn b5 to target the bishop. And the general rule, whenever black prepares to play b5, white can respond with a4. Just a prophylactic move. Also attempting just to kind of clamp down. There's potential later to play bishop d2 and a5 to have the two pawns fixed on the queen side. We also give some additional room for the bishop, opening the a2 square. Black usually will play bishop e7 here. White can go ahead, complete development. And then if castling, there is kind of a cool idea I recommend here to play knight g5, which might look odd at first. And already there's only one game from this position. But the idea of knight g5 is just to clear the way for the f pawn. And the way that white can actually initiate an attack here is to storm on the king side with potentially f4 and then f5. And meanwhile, if black tries to kick the knight with h6, we can very calmly drop back to h3 and then be ready to advance with f4. If black plays e5, we play f4, and we're not afraid of bishop takes h3. We can just take back, and then very soon have both the g and the f files to work with. Common to play king h1, potentially rook g1, also bring our queen in. There's cases where we'll play f5, have our bishop targeting h6. Keep in mind our other bishop is very nicely placed along the light square diagonal. And if we turn on the engine here, it will favor white. And I think from a practical standpoint, it's just much, much more enjoyable to play for white. So, of course, this is just one example line. There's different ways for the position to branch out after pawn d4 and c5, knight g3. But hopefully what I gave in terms of a development scheme for white can just offer a very pleasant and enjoyable middle game position. So let's move on to a slightly more rare and trappy line. For this one, we're going to see black playing bishop to g4, which Levy did mention in his video, but he didn't mention the line that I'm about to recommend, which is bishop to e2. Not the most common move, but a really, really tricky move. And if black's not careful, it can be very easy to lose material right away. Now, on the surface, this move is actually very natural. We break the pin against the knight. White prepares to castle and completes the kingside development way before black has even touched anything on the king side. And on top of this, one of the most attractive looking moves for black is actually a blunder here. That move being pawn to d4. Now, this move looks attractive because the knight no longer has the e2 square to drop back to. It looks like the knight has to go either back to b1 or to a4. But it turns out white has a really nice tactical trick, is just to take the pawn on d4. And even though the knight appears to be undefended, we are attacking the bishop on g4. So if takes, white just won a pawn. And if black tries to trade on e2 first, white can very simply take back with the knight. And again, white won the central pawn on d4, has a very clean pawn advantage going into the middle game. So this is a very prevalent trap, not only stemming from this opening, but in different types of openings. Whenever you see this combination of pieces, if a pawn ever lands on d4, you want to be hyper aware of the possibility of just taking it with your knight. So for this reason, it's better for black, of course, not to play d4, but to play a move like e6. And then here, white can very simply castle, complete development. Take note, if black plays d4 again, we still have the same trap. Knight takes d4, white wins the pawn, same exact tactic. And then going forward from here, if black plays knight f6, really trying to pressure the e-pawn, I can recommend diverting attention, attack the bishop, trying to provoke bishop takes f3, after which we can take, support the e-pawn, also getting the bishop pair. And if bishop to h5, there is kind of a cool idea I discovered when preparing this file to play the move knight e5, offering the bishop trade, and assuming black takes, we take with queen, reinforcing the e-pawn, and now we have ideas of lunging our f-pawn forward, also, of course, moving our pawn to d4, and if black now plays d4, we can simply retreat knight b1. I know it looks a little bit ugly, but we're actually setting up a cool idea here. If black plays the most natural move, bishop d6, we can now take on f7, clearing the way for the fork on e5. And this actually turns out to be a trade. We're guaranteed to win back a minor piece for a pawn. If takes, then white is slightly preferred by the engine. We've taken away black's passing rights. Very likely we'll play d3, develop the bishop, develop the knight, attack along the e-file, and have a pleasant game going forward. Now, for those that want even more analysis on this tricky bishop e2 line, I can highly recommend checking out Jonathan Trance's video, which is linked in the Lichess study. I'll link it below in the description as well. He has a 30-minute plus video covering a lot of the branches of this line. He goes way more in depth. He also likes to cover like really tricky offbeat openings. So be sure to check out his video if you want to learn this specific variation in much more depth. Okay, so we are reaching the final chapter of this video, of this Lichess study, is what to do against knight to f6 on move 3. And I will admit, originally when planning like what to show in this video, I was going to leave out this move because it's not the most popular move. If we look up the position on Lichess, knight f6 is fourth most popular. But then upon doing a little bit of research, I actually discovered some really nice gambit style lines to play. So I figured this is just extra bonus. And for those watching, hopefully this will give you an even more kind of robust repertoire if you do encounter this move from time to time. So the move I recommend here is on e5, hitting the knight, forcing the knight to either retreat or move forward. Knight e4 is the most popular move, but first we'll quickly look at knight d7. This allows white to play a really cool gambit, which is supported by the engine. Actually, if we turn on Stockfish here, the top engine move is to just gambit our e-pawn, pawn e6. The point being, after f takes e6, we're not going to go for any immediate tactics. We're just going to go for positional compensation. I recommend playing d4, and this structure, even though black has 3 center pawns, the pawns are a bit stuck, and it's really hard to complete development for black, given that the pawns are kind of just in the way of the minor pieces. So the most common move for black is to bring the knight back to f6, and then white can complete development with bishop d3. And honestly, if you know how to get to this position, you don't need to know too much more specific lines. It's just a matter of knowing some basic ideas going into the middle game. Very often, white wants to clamp down on this e5 square, develop the bishop to f4, put it on an e5, castle, eventually bring a rook to f1. Another idea is if black ever plays pawn g6, we can go straight ahead and play pawn h4, going for the immediate attack against these black kingside pawns. And there's actually a really funny line here. If black goes for bishop to g7, we can play pawn h5. This is actually one of the more common lines stemming from this e6 gambit. And if knight takes h5, a lot of players will play rook h5, which is still computer approved. But the engine will give an even stronger move here for white, pawn to g4, forcing the knight to move back. And then really nice idea, bishop h6, trying to remove one of the main defenders on the king side. After takes. If black is greedy and tries to win a pawn, we have the nice move rook h4 with a double threat of rook takes g4 and also bishop takes g6, taking advantage of the h-file pin. So this is just a nice tidbit of opening preparation I discovered when looking through this variation. A very flowing line, white keeps initiative throughout and gets a position where even though you're down material, the engine prefers white, and black is very soon about to just crumble. So going back to the main line, if black plays a more popular move, knight to e4, I can recommend the third most popular move here, knight takes e4, which is going to result in yet another gambit after pawn takes e4, knight g5. Black can win this pawn with queen d4, but we're not afraid. We're going to play d3. Pawn takes d3, bishop takes d3, queen takes e5, and now bishop to e3. And at the cost of a pawn, we have our minor pieces developed. We're ready to castle. We have the two center files to work with very soon. Of course, we want to bring a rook to e1, probably eventually queen f3 or queen h5, bring another rook to d1. And if black gets greedy and grabs a b2 pawn, white can very simply castle. The engine already gives white a very big plus. And I don't want to go too much in depth, but I just wanted to show this as inspiration, especially for those that really enjoy giving away material for quick compensation and initiative. This line is computer approved, and there's lots of opportunities to explore more deeply. So just quick recommendation if you do encounter knight f6 and knight e4. Okay, so I think we've covered the main bases. Of course, there's always more to cover. So I'm sure there's going to be questions from people in the comments. So if you do have questions about any of the lines I covered, feel free to leave a comment below. Feel free to check out the Lichess study and use the Opening Explorer or Stockfish to analyze further. And good luck in your games against the Caro-Kann. And if you enjoyed this video and want to see more kind of opening trap style videos, let me know what openings you would like me to cover in the future. And with that, I will see you in the next video.